All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be getting into some metaethics. And as always, we're, kind of assuming a pretty sophisticated listener. So we're going to be diving into this topic, constructivism, with kind of an assumption that you're following along with us.
Yeah, we're going to be going pretty deep, so make sure you brought your thinking caps.
Definitely. And we've got, a lot of different sources that we're going to be pulling from today. But probably the most important one is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So kind of our mission today is to really explore the different ways that constructivism has been presented, the different forms it takes, and, kind of think through what it means for metaethics.
Right. So we're going to be looking at how it fits into the landscape of moral realism versus anti-realism.
Yeah, and we're going to try to do this all in a way that's really going to speak to you as a philosopher, someone who's already, pretty familiar with these kinds of concepts.
Right, so we're not going to be spending a lot of time on the basics here. We're going to be getting right into the more complicated stuff.
Definitely. So to start off, let's just kind of set the stage a little bit. When we talk about constructivism in metaethics, what are we really talking about?
So the basic idea is that the truths about what we ought to do, what we should do, the norms, that govern our behavior, they're not out there in some kind of mind-independent moral reality waiting for us to find them.
So it's not like there are moral facts, like there are physical facts that are just, there, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. Instead, these truths, these norms, they're constructed. They're kind of the product of a process.
Okay, and what is that process? Who's doing the constructing here?
Well, that's where things start to get interesting and where there's a lot of variety in the different versions of constructivism. But the basic idea is that these norms are in some way grounded in the nature of rational agency. So what it means to be a rational person, the kinds of reasons that we recognize, the kinds of agreements we could come to. That's kind of the starting point for the construction process.
Okay, so it's not just about what we personally want or what our individual cultures dictate, but it's more about what rational agents would agree to under certain conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So when did this idea of constructivism in moral philosophy really start to, take hold? When did it become a big thing?
Well, the term, as we use it now, really took off with John Rawls.
Oh, Rawls, of course.
Yeah, so in 1980, he gave the Dewey Lectures, and they were called Kantian Constructivism in Moral Theory. So that's kind of where this term really comes into its own.
And Rawls was really interested in political philosophy, right?
Yes, he was very much concerned with how we justify principles of justice.
So I guess he was thinking about this constructivist approach as a way to deal with political disagreement.
Exactly. He saw that political debates often got bogged down when people were trying to appeal to some kind of ultimate moral truth.
Like, my position is right because it's based on the objective truth, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Rawls thought that this was kind of problematic, especially in societies that are pluralistic, where people have different values.
So it's kind of hard to have a productive conversation if everyone's just claiming to have the one true answer.
Right, and Rawls thought that constructivism could offer a way to think about objectivity, but in a way that was more practical, more focused on how we can reach agreement, even when we have fundamental disagreements about values.
Okay, so it's less about discovering some ultimate moral reality and more about figuring out what we can all agree on as a basis for living together.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So where does Kant come into all of this?
Well, Rawls thought that Kant, at least his interpretation of Kant, offered a really interesting way to think about objectivity in these practical terms.
So he saw Kant as a kind of constructivist, even though Kant didn't use that term himself.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Interesting. And how did Rawls interpret Kant in this way?
So Rawls argued that for Kant, morality wasn't about, just following rules that were handed down from on high or, figuring out what God wanted us to do.
It wasn't about divine command or something like that.
Right. Instead, it was about reason. And in particular, it was about practical reason, the part of reason that's concerned with figuring out what we have reason to do.
Okay, so what we should do rather than what we just happen to want to do.
Exactly. And Rawls thought that Kant was offering a way to think about morality as the outcome of a process of reasoning, a process of figuring out what principles we could all agree to.
So it's not about finding some pre-existing moral truth out there, but rather about constructing principles through a process of rational deliberation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But when we talk about Kantian constructivism, we know it's not just one monolithic thing, right? There are all sorts of different versions of it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of variety within Kantian constructivism, but there are some core ideas that most of these versions share.
So what are some of those core ideas? What ties all these different Kantian constructivists together?
Well, one of the big ones is this idea that um, moral truths are grounded in rational agency.
Yeah.
So they're not grounded in, our desires or our feelings or, the particular customs of our society.
So it's not like, what's right for one culture might be wrong for another culture.
Right. Instead, the idea is that moral truths are based on what it means to be a rational agent, period.
So if you're a rational agent, these truths would apply to you no matter who you are or where you come from.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. It is. And it's one of the things that makes Kantian constructivism so appealing, but also so challenging.
Definitely. And another core idea that most Kantian constructivists share is this emphasis on the categorical imperative.
Ah, yes, the categorical imperative. Can you remind us what that is again?
Sure. So it's basically Kant's supreme principle of morality. And there are different formulations of it, but the one that's probably most relevant here is the idea that we should only act on maxims that we could universalize.
Maxims. What are those?
So a maxim is basically the principle behind your action. It's the rule that you're following when you act. So, for example, if you're thinking about lying to get out of a jam, the maxim might be something like, it's okay to lie when it's convenient.
Okay, and the categorical imperative says that we should only act on maxims that we could universalize. Meaning what exactly?
Meaning that you should only act in a way that you could rationally will that everyone else act the same way in similar circumstances.
So if you couldn't rationally will that everyone lie whenever it was convenient, then lying in this particular case would be wrong.
Exactly. And Kantian constructivists see the categorical imperative as a kind of procedure for testing our maxims and figuring out which ones are morally acceptable.
Okay, so it's a way of constructing moral principles, you could say.
Yeah, exactly. But even though Kantian constructivists share these core ideas, there are still a lot of differences in how they develop these ideas.
Okay, so let's get into some of those different versions. Let's start with Rawls' own interpretation of Kant, since that's where we started this whole conversation.
Okay, so Rawls argued that Kant was really concerned with distinguishing his own view from two other major ethical theories that were popular at the time.
Okay, and what were those theories?
So the first one was sentimentalism.
Sentimentalism, okay. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically the idea that our moral judgments are ultimately based on feelings or sentiments.
So it's not about reason, it's about how we feel.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And some of the big proponents of this view were Hume and Adam Smith.
Okay, so they thought that, we judge things to be right or wrong based on whether they evoke feelings of approval or disapproval in us.
Exactly. And Kant thought that this was a problem because it made morality too subjective, too dependent on our individual feelings, which can vary a lot from person to person.
So if morality is just about feelings, then there's no real objective standard for right and wrong. It's just whatever we happen to feel.
Right. And Kant thought that morality had to have some kind of objective basis, something that wasn't just dependent on our subjective feelings.
So sentimentalism was out. What was the other view that Kant was rejecting?
So the other view was what Kant called dogmatic rationalism.
Dogmatic rationalism, okay. And who were some of the proponents of this view?
Well, some of the big names were Wolff and Leibniz.
Okay, and what did they believe?
So they believed that moral truths were kind of like mathematical truths. They're just out there waiting to be discovered by reason.
So reason can just sort of intuit these moral truths directly without needing to go through any kind of constructive process.
Yeah, that's the idea. And Kant thought that this was also a problem for a couple of reasons.
Okay, and what were those reasons?
Well, first of all, he thought that it made morality too passive. It's just about discovering these truths that are already out there. And he thought that morality should be more active, more about what we do with our reason.
So it should be more about constructing moral principles rather than just discovering them.
Mm-hmm, right. And secondly, he thought that it didn't really explain why we should care about morality. If moral truths are just like mathematical truths, why should we feel any obligation to follow them?
So it's not clear why we should be motivated to act morally if it's just about grasping these abstract truths.
Exactly. And Kant thought that morality had to have some kind of connection to our own will, to our own agency.
So it's not just about knowing what's right, it's about choosing to do what's right.
Yeah, that's a key part of it. So Rawls argued that Kant was rejecting both sentimentalism and dogmatic rationalism in favor of a view that he called constructivism.
Okay, and what were the key features of this constructivist view, according to Rawls?
Well, one of the key features was this idea that reason is autonomous,
Autonomous, meaning what?
meaning that it's self-governing. It's not governed by something outside of itself, like feelings or pre-existing moral truths.
So it's not dictated by something external, but rather it sets its own laws.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the fundamental law of reason, according to Kant, is the categorical imperative.
So the categorical imperative is kind of like the constitution of reason, you could say.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And Rawls argued that this idea of the autonomy of reason was crucial for understanding Kant's constructivism.
Okay, and how so?
Well, because it means that moral principles are not just given to us, they're not just out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, we have to construct them through a process of reasoning. And this process of reasoning is governed by the categorical imperative.
So it's a process of self-legislation, you could say. We're not just following rules that are imposed on us, but rather we're creating our own rules through a process of rational deliberation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Rawls thought that this was a really powerful idea because it meant that morality was grounded in our own rationality, in our own capacity for self-governance.
So it's not something that's alien to us or something that's imposed on us from the outside. It's something that we create through our own reasoning.
Yeah. And Rawls thought that this made morality more meaningful, more motivating, because it's connected to our own agency.
So we have a reason to care about morality because it's something that we're creating, something that we're invested in.
Right. But of course, Rawls' interpretation of Kant is just one interpretation. There are other ways to read Kant, and there are other versions of Kantian constructivism out there.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those other versions. One that comes to mind is Christine Korsgaard's idea of procedural realism. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Korsgaard is another really important figure in Kantian constructivism, and she calls her view procedural realism.
Procedural realism, okay. And how does that differ from Rawls' view?
Well, Korsgaard agrees with Rawls that moral truths are constructed, not discovered. But she emphasizes the idea that there are correct procedures for constructing these truths.
So it's not just anything goes. It's not just any old construction process that will lead to moral truth.
Right. There are certain standards that have to be met, certain procedures that have to be followed, and these procedures are what make the construction process objective.
So it's not just about what we happen to agree on, but about what we would agree on if we were reasoning correctly.
Yeah, exactly. And Korsgaard sees the categorical imperative as the ultimate standard for correct practical reasoning.
So the categorical imperative is kind of like the gold standard for the construction process.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And she argues that this procedural approach can answer the skeptic's challenge.
The skeptic's challenge. What do you mean by that?
So the skeptic basically asks, why should I be moral? What reason do I have to follow these moral rules?
Right. It's a classic question in ethics.
Yeah. And Korsgaard thinks that procedural realism can answer this challenge by showing that moral obligations are grounded in the very nature of rational agency.
Okay, so how does it do that?
Well, Korsgaard argues that we're all self-reflective agents. We can step back from our immediate desires and ask ourselves, what should I do?
So we're not just driven by our impulses. We can reflect on our reasons for action.
Right. And this capacity for self-reflection is what makes us moral agents, because it means that we can hold ourselves accountable to standards of reasons.
So we can ask ourselves, are my reasons for acting good reasons?
Exactly. And Korsgaard thinks that the categorical imperative is the ultimate standard for evaluating our reasons.
So if we're reasoning correctly, if we're applying the categorical imperative properly, then we'll arrive at moral truth.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And she thinks that this shows that moral obligations are not arbitrary. They're not just based on our feelings or our cultural norms. They're grounded in the very structure of rational agency.
Okay, so that's Korsgaard's view. Another version of Kantian constructivism that we should talk about is Honora O'Neill's view.
Yeah, so O'Neill's a really interesting figure because she tries to develop a Kantian constructivism that doesn't rely on these kind of high-flying transcendental arguments.
Transcendental arguments, meaning?
Meaning arguments that try to, prove the existence of God or the soul or, some kind of ultimate reality.
Right. So O'Neill's trying to ground morality in something more down to earth.
Exactly. She focuses on the idea of finite rational agents. So agents like us who have limited knowledge, limited resources, and who are vulnerable to each other.
So she's taking into account the limitations of human beings.
Yeah, and she argues that this focus on finitude leads to a different kind of Kantian constructivism.
Okay, and what are some of the key features of this different kind of constructivism?
Well, one of the key features is that it doesn't start with the categorical imperative.
Okay, so it's not about applying the categorical imperative as a test for our maxims.
Right. Instead, it starts with the idea that we're all interdependent.
Yeah.
We all rely on each other for our survival and well-being.
So we're not just isolated individuals, we're part of a community.
Exactly. And O'Neill thinks that this interdependence leads to certain requirements for how we should treat each other.
Okay, and what are some of those requirements?
Well, for example, she thinks that we can't rationally will that anyone be harmed or coerced or deceived.
So these are kind of basic principles of respect for persons.
Yeah, exactly. And O'Neill thinks that these principles are not just arbitrary, they're grounded in our interdependence.
Okay, and how so?
Well, she argues that if we're going to live together, if we're going to cooperate, then we need to be able to trust each other. And we can't trust each other if we're constantly harming, coercing, or deceiving each other.
So these principles are necessary for social cooperation.
Right. And O'Neill thinks that this is a more grounded, more realistic way to think about Kantian constructivism.
So it's not about abstract principles that apply to all rational beings, but rather about principles that are necessary for us as finite, interdependent human beings to live together.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about Rawls' view, Korsgaard's view, and O'Neill's view. Those are all different versions of Kantian constructivism.
Right.
But there are other kinds of constructivism out there, right? Ones that aren't based on Kant.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are a lot of different ways to be a constructivist.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those other approaches. One that comes to mind is what's sometimes called Humean constructivism.
Yeah, so Humean constructivism is a really interesting approach because it takes its inspiration from Hume, who was a famous skeptic about morality.
Skeptic, meaning that he didn't think that there were any objective moral truths.
Yeah, that's basically it. Hume thought that morality was ultimately based on our feelings and sentiments.
So he was a sentimentalist, like we talked about earlier.
Right, but Humean constructivists take a different approach.
Okay, so how do they differ from Hume himself?
Well, they agree with Hume that morality is not based on some kind of mind-independent moral reality.
So they reject moral realism.
Yeah, but they don't think that morality is just about feelings.
Okay, so what do they think it's about?
Well, they think that morality is constructed, just like Kantian constructivists do. But they think that the construction process is based on our desires, our values, our commitments.
So it's not about reason, it's about our subjective preferences.
Yeah, that's a key difference. And one of the most important figures in Humean constructivism is Sharon Street.
Okay, and what does she say about this construction process?
So Street argues that our moral judgments are constructed from our evaluative attitudes.
Evaluative attitudes, meaning?
Meaning our likes and dislikes, our preferences, our values.
So what we find good or bad, right or wrong.
Exactly. And Street thinks that these evaluative attitudes are not just arbitrary.
Okay, so there's some kind of rationale behind them.
Yeah, she thinks that they're shaped by our evolutionary history, our cultural background, our personal experiences.
So they're not just random, they're the product of a long and complex process of development.
Right. And Street argues that we can use these evaluative attitudes to construct moral norms.
So we can figure out what's right or wrong by looking at what we value, what we care about.
Yeah, and she thinks that this process is objective in a sense, because it's not just about what any one person happens to value, it's about what a community of people values over time.
So it's kind of like a cultural evolution of moral norms.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But of course, this kind of view has some controversial implications.
Such as?
Well, for one thing, it seems to imply that there's no one true morality.
Because different cultures might have different values, different evaluative attitudes.
Exactly. And that's a pretty radical claim. It means that, we can't say that one culture's morality is better or worse than another culture's morality.
So it leads to a kind of moral relativism.
Yeah. And Street embraces this relativism. She thinks that it's just a fact about morality.
That's a pretty bold stance.
It is. It is. And it's one of the things that makes human constructivism so controversial.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about Kantian constructivism and Humean constructivism. Are there any other major types of constructivism that we should discuss?
Yeah, there's one more that I think is worth mentioning, and that's Aristotelian constructivism.
Aristotelian constructivism, okay. And how does that differ from the other two?
Well, Aristotelian constructivism takes its inspiration from Aristotle, obviously.
Obvious.
And one of the key ideas in Aristotle's ethics is the idea of eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia, okay. What does that mean?
It's often translated as happiness or flourishing. But it's not just about feeling good. It's about living a good life, a life that's in accordance with reason and virtue.
So it's about fulfilling our potential as human beings.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Aristotelian constructivists think that moral norms are constructed in such a way as to promote eudaimonia.
So the goal of morality is to help us live good lives.
Exactly. And they think that this construction process is guided by practical wisdom, or phronesis.
Phronesis, okay. And what's that?
It's basically the ability to make good judgments in concrete situations. It's about knowing what to do in particular circumstances based on experience and good judgment.
So it's not just about following abstract rules, it's about knowing how to apply those rules in the real world.
Right. And Aristotelian constructivists think that this practical wisdom is something that we develop over time through experience and reflection.
So it's not something that we're just born with, it's something that we cultivate.
Yeah, and they think that it's essential for constructing moral norms that will actually help us to live good lives.
Okay, so that's Aristotelian constructivism. Now, we've been talking about these different versions of constructivism in pretty broad terms, but there are also constructivists who focus on more specific issues.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are constructivists who focus on, particular moral principles like justice or rights or duties.
Okay, and how do they approach these issues from a constructivist perspective?
Well, one common approach is to use the idea of a hypothetical contract.
A hypothetical contract, okay. What's that?
So it's basically an agreement that rational agents would come to under certain idealized conditions.
So it's not a real contract that anyone actually signs, it's more of a thought experiment.
Exactly. And the idea is that by thinking about what kind of agreement rational agents would come to, we can figure out what moral principles are justified.
Okay, and who are some of the constructivists who use this approach?
Well, one of the most famous is Thomas Scanlon.
Oh, Scanlon, of course.
Yeah, so Scanlon argues that an action is wrong if it violates a principle that no one could reasonably reject.
So it's wrong if it would be unreasonable for anyone to object to a rule prohibiting that action.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Scanlon thinks that this is a way to ground morality in reason without appealing to any kind of mind-independent moral reality.
Okay, so it's a constructivist approach to morality, but it's focused on specific moral principles, like the principle of not harming others.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So we've talked about a lot of different versions of constructivism, but I think it's worth taking a step back and asking, where does constructivism fit into the broader landscape of metaethics?
Right. So one of the big debates in metaethics is between moral realism and moral anti-realism.
Can you remind us what those terms mean again?
Sure. So moral realism is the view that there are objective moral truths, truths about right and wrong that are true independently of what anyone happens to believe or feel.
Okay, and moral anti-realism is the opposite view, right? It's the view that there are no objective moral truths.
Exactly. And so one of the questions that comes up a lot is, where does constructivism fit into this debate?
Yeah, is it a form of realism or a form of anti-realism?
Well, that's a tricky question, and there's no easy answer.
Okay, so why is it so tricky?
Well, because constructivism seems to have elements of both realism and anti-realism.
Okay, can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So, on the one hand, constructivists agree with moral realists that there are objective moral truths. They don't think that morality is just a matter of opinion or personal preference.
Okay, so in that sense, they're kind of on the side of the realists.
Right. But on the other hand, constructivists agree with moral anti-realists that these objective moral truths are not mind-independent. They're not just out there waiting to be discovered. Instead, they're constructed by us through a process of reasoning or deliberation.
So in that sense, they're kind of on the side of the anti-realists.
Right. So constructivism kind of sits in between moral realism and moral anti-realism.
It's a kind of middle ground, you could say.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it, and it's one of the things that makes constructivism so interesting.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about how constructivism fits into the realism-anti-realism debate. But there's another big issue in metaethics that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the question of how we know moral truths.
Yeah, so this is the question of moral epistemology.
Moral epistemology. Okay. And what's that all about?
Well, it's about how we come to know what's right and wrong. What are our sources of moral knowledge?
Right. Because it's one thing to say that there are objective moral truths, but it's another thing to say that we can actually know what those truths are.
Exactly. And this is a really tricky question for constructivists, because they're saying that moral truths are not just out there, waiting to be discovered.
So we can't just, look around and see what's right and wrong.
Right. Instead, we have to construct them through a process of reasoning or deliberation.
So how do we know that we're constructing them correctly? How do we know that we're not just making stuff up?
Yeah, that's the big challenge for constructivist moral epistemology.
Okay, and how do constructivists try to answer this challenge?
Well, there are different approaches. Some constructivists appeal to the idea of reflective equilibrium.
Reflective equilibrium, okay. What's that?
So it's basically the idea that we can test our moral beliefs by seeing how well they cohere with our other beliefs and our intuitions.
So if we have a moral belief that clashes with our other beliefs or our intuitions, then we have to revise one or the other.
Right. And the goal is to reach a state of equilibrium where our beliefs and intuitions are all consistent with each other.
Okay, and constructivists think that this process of reflective equilibrium can help us to construct moral truths.
Yeah, they think that it can help us to identify the principles that we would all agree to if we were reasoning correctly.
So it's a way of testing our moral constructions, you could say.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, this approach has its critics.
Such as?
Well, some critics argue that reflective equilibrium is too subjective.
Because it's based on our intuitions, which can vary from person to person.
Right. And so they worry that it doesn't really give us a way to get to objective moral truths.
Okay, so reflective equilibrium is one approach to constructivist moral epistemology. Are there any other approaches?
Yeah, another approach is to appeal to the idea of ideal rationality.
Ideal rationality, okay. What's that all about?
So it's the idea that we can figure out what's right and wrong by thinking about what perfectly rational agents would do.
So we're imagining these kind of super rational beings who are able to reason flawlessly.
Right. And the idea is that by thinking about what these ideal rational agents would do, we can figure out what moral principles are justified.
Okay, and who are some of the constructivists who use this approach?
Well, one of the most famous is Korsgaard, who we talked about earlier.
Right, the procedural realists.
Exactly. So Korsgaard argues that we can identify moral truths by thinking about what principles would be chosen by a kingdom of ends.
A kingdom of ends, okay. What's that?
So it's basically a community of perfectly rational beings who are all treating each other as ends in themselves rather than as means to their own ends.
So it's a kind of ideal moral community.
Right. And Korsgaard thinks that the principles that would govern such a community would be the true moral principles.
Okay, so it's kind of like a thought experiment, like the hypothetical contract idea.
Yeah, exactly. But again, this approach has its critics. Well, some critics argue that it's too abstract, too removed from the real world.
Because it's based on these hypothetical, ideal, rational agents who don't actually exist.
Right, and so they worry that it doesn't really tell us anything about how we should live our lives in the actual world.
Okay, so that's the ideal rationality approach. Are there any other approaches to constructivist moral epistemology?
Yeah, there are a few others, but I think those are the two main ones.
Okay, so we've talked about constructa.